In this video, we're going to make some configuration changes to Android Studio and also install a few extra options that are going to be very useful for you. So you want to start by launching Android Studio, and once you get in there, click on Configure and then select SDK Manager. Now the SDK Manager is where we manage the various components of Android Studio and where we can update and get things deleted. So when it starts, you probably saw there was a little pause. We saw a status at the bottom of the window, and that's because Android Studio was checking whether any tools that we've already installed had updates. So every time you come into here, it's going to be doing the same thing. Now if you've installed Android Studio 2.2, there'll actually be a link down here somewhere to the bottom left-hand corner of the screen to something called the Standalone SDK Manager. Now I used to prefer using that, but Google have removed it from the SDK, so that link will no longer do anything. Now the link's removed in Android Studio 2.3, that's the version that I'm running a beta version of that. So the bottom line is, if you see a link there to the Standalone SDK Manager, don't worry about it, it no longer works. Now if I mention the Standalone SDK Manager in a later video, that's what I'm actually referring to. Now it didn't let you do anything that you can't do from this screen, it just was a little bit less cluttered because all the other settings stuff that you can see here to the left wasn't displayed. Now this window, by the way, is resizable, so make sure you do open it out so you can see all the various names and levels and revisions, etc. Alright, so at the top of the screen here we can see to the right of Android SDK location, and this is the path to the SDK, also known as the Software Development Kit for Android. Now the SDK is all the various classes and files that make up Android, as well as things like the emulators, which we'll be talking about shortly, and a few other programming tools as well. Now one problem you may get is if you've installed the Software Development Kit in a location that contains spaces in its path. Now I'm on a Mac, so the path will be different to Windows machines, but if you've got a space anywhere in your path here for the Android SDK location, you're probably going to be wanting to move this. And I'm going to talk about how to do that shortly. But in general, it's not a good idea to use spaces in the names of objects, including directories and usernames, but Windows does allow it. So if there is a space somewhere in your SDK path, for example, you might have C:\users\Tim Pachowka for argument's sake, then you are going to want to move this to another path to avoid problems. Now this doesn't just affect Android Studio, you will find that you get problems with other programs if your home directory contains a space. So in that scenario, if you have got a space in the Android SDK location, I'd suggest you need to move your SDK folder to a different location so there's no spaces in its path. And you can do that by navigating using Windows Explorer, assuming you're on Windows, to the folder that you can see here, and copying all the files and moving them to a folder that doesn't have any spaces in the path name. A good place to put it in might be in the /users/public folder. That's a good one because you get full permissions there, so there won't be any problems moving it there. Alternatively, just put it in any folder that you can write to without having any spaces in the name. So at this point I'm going to presume you've done that and you're now moved and have your Android SDK location is pointing to a path that doesn't have any spaces in its path name. Alright, so this is the Android SDK Manager, and from here we can install additional features. We can also update components if updates are available from Google, and they do update this on a regular basis. So on the SDK Platforms tab, this first one here to the left, you can actually see all the various versions of Android dating right back to version 2.1, which was released a heck of a long time ago, and that was Android 2.1 Eclair. And you can see at the moment we're on Android Studio 7.1.1 Nougat. That's the latest version as at the time I'm recording this video. To see more information, come over here and click on the checkbox to the left of Show Package Details, and you can now see that we get the specifics of the various options you can select for each version of Android. Now there's really no need to install most of the previous Android versions, and in fact I certainly don't suggest you try to install all of them. The latest Android SDK platform, which currently for me is 7.1.1 Nougat, also allows you to create apps that run on earlier versions, so you don't need the other versions to create your apps. The other thing to be aware of is that your SDK directory can get very big if you install a lot of options. It's very easy to get to 40 gigabytes or more, and even that's without everything being installed. So if you went a bit mad here, you could use up an awful lot of disk space. However, if you do want to preview layouts in earlier Android versions, then you'll need to install the Android SDK platform, one component for any version that you want to test. And that may not make a lot of sense at the moment, but we'll do later in the course. Alright, so there's quite a few options here, but it does look far worse than it actually is. The various components are pretty much the same for every Android version, so you can really just concentrate on these two latest versions, Android 7.1.1 and Android 7.0. It is always worth checking the one version, the main version, before the latest, in this case Android 7.0, and that's because sometimes Google doesn't make everything available in the latest version straight away. There can be a delay. So one example might be the source code. You can see even though there's sources for Android 25 here and sources for Android 24, it took Google quite a few months to get this sources option for Android 25 and make that available. So sometimes you'll need to go back to the previous version and select the option. But in general, apart from that, pretty well everything else is going to be usually available in the latest version that you're going to be downloading. So in terms of these various components, the first part is the Android SDK platform, and we will most definitely need that. That's Android and is needed for us to build apps, so make sure you've got that checked for the latest version. And you can see, in fact, in my case, it's already been installed automatically when I actually installed Android Studio. So if it's not checked for some reason, or it's not installed, make sure you've selected that. The next component we're going to want here is the sources for Android 25, so I'm going to click on that to make sure that that's selected as well. And just a note about uninstalling things, it is possible you can come over here and click, and if I click on that, something that was already installed, you can see we've got a red cross over here to the left, and that's indicating that in fact that's going to be uninstalled. So take care when you actually are clicking things that you're not uninstalling something that you need. And it's not really a big deal, because if the worst come to the worst, you could come out of the screen and come back in and install it again. But it's a good idea just to check. And again, you can see the little helpful icon there. I'm going to check that back again to leave that as installed. Alright, now anything you see here that's got Android TV or Android Wear in it, we don't actually want installed. They relate to applications for Android TV, for TVs running the Android operating system, or a Wear device. Android Wear is a device like a watch or something along those lines. Since we're not supporting either of those, I suggest you leave those not installed, or if they are installed, you could click take the checkbox off to uninstall them, because we won't be using them. That really only leaves us with these four options here, and these are the emulators. Where you see it mentioned system image, that's actually an emulator. So we need to install one of the remaining four, and which one that you choose depends on whether you've got HAXM installed or not. Now if HAXM installed successfully, the only option you would need to click is this one here, this Google API's Intel x86 Atom System Image. And just a note here, you might be looking at this _64 and thinking that maybe you need to install that one. Well, you don't need it, because that's actually the version of Android and not whether your operating system's 64-bit or not. So that's the ideal choice. If HAXM ran successfully, or you're running a Mac, because all modern Macs run HAXM, you'll know that that's the version to select. If you've got a low amount of memory and HAXM didn't work for some reason, then the other option that you want here is going to be this ARM EABI V7A system image. And by the way, in case you're looking down here on Android 7.0, you'll note there's a few extra options here for system images that haven't got this Google API name in front of it. Well, you generally don't want those. You want to install something that starts with Google APIs, and that's basically an emulator, and that basically allows you to test, and it includes the Google APIs, so you can test things like Google Maps, so on and so forth. And just to make it clear, and again, an emulator, the reason we're using an emulator in this course is to allow our apps to run on our computer, so we can actually test our apps without buying a lot of Android phones for testing on. So it's really quite useful. Alright, so I've selected one of the four options here, so I've now got my emulator ready to be installed. The next thing we want to do now is install some system images for older versions of Android Studio, just for a couple, and that's because later on in this course we're going to be testing our apps on a couple of earlier versions of Android. So we're just going to go ahead and install what we need now, so when you get to that stage in the course you'll be ready to go. So we're going to be testing them on API 25, which is the current version, but also scrolling down and you can see this number here to the right, Android Studio, Android SDK Platform 25, that means API 25, so we're going to go down until we find 21, and that should be Android 5.0, and we're going to click it over here, click on scroll down, and we're going to choose the relevant emulator. In this case, I'm going to choose Google API's Intel x86 Atom System Image, which matches what I had selected when I chose the emulator for API 25. So I need to click on that, plus I need to click on the Android SDK platform. And then likewise, scrolling down, I'm going to go right down to version 4.1 Jelly Bean, which is API 16, and there's the number 16 there. And I'm going to choose Android SDK Platform 16, and I'm also going to choose again the same option, x86 Atom System Image. Once we've done that, I'm going to click on Apply. Helpfully, Android Studio gives you a summary of what's about to happen, and you can see that I've selected the various tools that I actually need there. So at this point, I'm going to click on OK, and there'll be a little pop-up that will come up. I need to come over here and click on Accept. Then I need to click on Next. Now that's going to start the download process because we've now accepted the license agreement. Now keep in mind that depending on what you've selected, this can take quite a while to actually download and install. The software development kit, the SDK, is far bigger than Android Studio, and those system images are around 1 GB each. So I'm actually going to finish the video here, and we'll come back after the installation has completed, and then we'll go through and do a few final things, and then we'll be ready to continue. So I'll see you in the next video.